Okay, welcome everyone to the first in a series of videos that we're calling EJIS Conversations. My name is Jason Ralph. I am a professor of international relations at the University of Leeds, and I co-edit EJIS with Jackie True and Edward Newman. And I'm joined today by one of our regional editors, Professor Navnita Chadha Behera. She is a professor of international relations at the University of Delhi. She is author and editor of many publications, including India Engages the World and International Relations in South Asia, Search for an Alternative Paradigm. Welcome, Navnita. How are you?
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Good. So today, we're interested in talking about post-Western international relations, and in particular, what that growing literature in that area means specifically for security studies.
Right.
Now, Navnita has recently published an article with her co-author, Giorgio Shani, in a recent special issue of the Review of International Studies, which is our BISA's other journal, of course, and that article is called Provincialising International Relations Through a Reading of Dharma. Now, what I really like about this article, Navnita, is that it's speaking to that interest in pluralising international relations, moving beyond post-Western narratives, beyond Western-centric concepts, and perhaps democratising epistemic authority. Is that right? Have I read it right? Perhaps you can tell us more about Dharma and how it speaks to these themes.
Yeah, it's been a kind of a problematic that one has been dealing for quite some time. I find that social sciences in general and international relations or security studies in particular, they've had, this sort of epistemic privilege, I call it, of Eurocentrism. In fact, in one of my earlier papers on state and sovereignty, I termed it the E-problematique of IR. Eurocentrism, privileging the epistemic claims and empiricism. And basically together, these are very powerful discursive tools, which have effectively ended up sort of erasing or silencing or marginalizing voices from other parts of the world. Their epistemic claims are judged by parameters that are set by Western modernity and never make the cut, so to say. So the idea of provincializing IR, and we borrow Dipesh Chakravarti's term here, to basically say that these social and political categories are important, but inadequate. So we are not trying to sort of negate the importance of a very rich contribution of a whole, scholarship that has emerged from the West. But what we are saying is that that does not necessarily hold for the entire world. We inhabit several worlds, and we need to kind of speak to these other large parts of humanity, wearing very different lenses, because they come through very different lived experiences and histories and cultures and so on and so forth. So in this particular article that I co-authored with Giorgio Shani, this is part of a special issue on pluriversal relationality for the Review of International Studies. And the basic idea, as I said, is that there are different worlds out there, and the lived practices of large parts of world of people are governed by what we call the relational cosmologies, that relations come before entities. The interconnection is important or prior to separation of an entity. And could it be any unit of analysis, individual, state, society, anything. And dharma is, of course, an interest to me coming from India. It's almost like a 5,000 years old tradition. And I want to add a rider here that the dharmic cosmology is talked about in Hinduism over 5,000 years. There are several iterations of dharma within Hinduism, but it's also talked about in Buddhism, in Jainism, in Sikhism, in several other ancient Indian, sort of cosmological traditions and worldviews. So what we did was we basically took one text, Mahabharata. It's probably one of the oldest recorded texts in the world, written somewhere between 400 BCE and 400 AD. It's a story about a mythical dynasty of Bharat, but it has probably the single largest articulation of the cosmology of dharma, which is why it interested us to look at that. And the basic idea of dharma is that it's not a product of sort of any revelations from God or based on any sacred scriptures. It's concerned with the basic foundations of human life, the universal foundations of human life, and how it sustains human life together in all its diversities. So the main concern is that the quality of human life, both in its personal and social domain, depends on the quality of a human with self and with others. And the two are not separate. And that's the critical point of departure that we take, that your relationship with yourself cannot be, sort of a quality relationship till your relationship with others is also good, and vice versa. And the other here is not just in terms of humans. It's the, your gods, your ancestors, your animals, your earth and sky and plants, any empirical other. It's a very expansive notion of the other that is understood in dharma. So what we tried to do was basically engage with that at a meta-theoretical level, and juxtapose it with the very core components of Western rationalist IR. And I'll just explain with one or two examples because of the paucity of time. We looked at, in the paper, we look at time, the notion of self, the notion of order, and the notion of sovereign state. But here, let me just explain you with one or two examples. Like, for example, the idea of time, the prevailing notion of time that all of us understand, perhaps quote unquote universally, is a linear notion of time, right? It's what Hodgkins called chronos. It's a linear successive notion of time. And what it has done is that it has embedded linearity as a mode of thinking, as a mode of social and political inquiry. So when we look at civilizations, the civilizations progress in a linear mode, from being barbarians to savages to uncivilized to civilized. We look at tradition to modernity, again a linear mode of thinking. We look at development, again a linear mode of development, from least developed countries to developing countries to developed world. So linearity became basically a mode of thinking, and it's all derived from a linear sense of time. What dharma does is it has a very different notion of time. The way it looks at time is that there is no beginning and an end, it's an eternal time. The metaphor that we have is that of a seed and a plant. A seed gives birth to a plant, and the plant gives birth to another seed, and the cycle sort of continues, in that sense. And it's that of ideas that of a co-creation. The plant is co-creating the seed, and the seed is co-creating the plant. So what we end up is contrasting a kind of a singular temporality of time, which is linear, to a heterotemporal notion of time, which is not many times, but many temporalities which intersect. So there is no superiority over here. We're not talking about one sense of understanding of time is better than the other. All we are saying is that they have evolved simultaneously and they intersect. And they're not necessarily to be fitted in one single meta-narrative, which is linear. Likewise, we look at the notion of the self and the other, which is a very core component of what we call the Judeo-Christian cosmology. And the Charles Taylor magnum opus of where he talks about buffered sense of identity. Now, buffered sense of identity is basically, very clearly articulating that there is a difference between the self and the other. There is a buffered self which differentiates itself from the other. Again, when you look at it in terms of social and the political lines of inquiry, over centuries, what has happened is that the self and other has extrapolated itself in several other lines of, created several binaries. For example, state and anarchy, civilized and the barbaric, men, women, white, black, objective, subjective. There are several binaries that it has created, and each is cast in a hierarchical term, where the self is privileged and the other is kind of less, a lesser category. So lesser privileged, or lesser in some sense, it lacks something. And dharma basically turns a very different lens. It offers a very different lens, because it says that human life by nature is composed of opposites, and you cannot deny either or without sort of inviting untruth or disorder, as to say, because the truth is not linear. The truth is not, self-complete in itself. And this practice of othering has produced a whole lines of inquiries in international relations, in security studies, in social sciences in general. And what we are arguing is that dharma as an alternative epistemic frame, as an epistemic way of thinking, way of knowing our life, offers a very different standpoint for understanding life.
Yeah, I find this fascinating, and I think there are the parallels there to work on relational ontology, and I've been doing work on pragmatism and the idea of growth, and the trying to be imaginative in how we overcome hierarchical binaries. We can talk more about that, but I'm really interested in how this relates to security studies, and security studies as it has been, as it's grown out of that Western IR, strategic studies, security studies, the anarchy problem, and how in particular this alternative view of self-other relations might impact upon how we have done security studies.
I think the basic opening that it gives us is of going back and sort of re-engaging the field of security studies at a meta-theoretical level. We need to really address ourselves to what are the different modes of knowledge production that we have taken for granted, that we have sort of assumed and taken as a starting point of inquiry. For example, when we talk about security studies, the question that scholars over a period of, from conventional security studies to critical security studies have grappled with the ideas of whose security, from whom. And there is an implicit understanding of the notion of the threat, of the fear. So when we look at the idea of, for example, order, the Hobbesian notion of order, the starting point of inquiry is fear, the fear of the other. And that's why you need to secure yourself, the survival. So whether it was a security dilemma in terms of survival of the individual or his state, or it is of the critical security studies when we talk about emancipation, from sort of needs and wants that are there. The new opening lines of inquiry would be, for example, who's asking these questions? Whose idea of security? Because if you assume, if your starting point of inquiry is that all human beings are interconnected, and you're looking at relational cosmology in terms of relations come prior to entities, then your basic questions of security studies will have to be reworked or reimagined, so to say. And that is something that one needs to look into. Now, there have been silences and omissions in both conventional security studies and critical security studies. For example, that of race. The question of race as a structuring principle of knowledge making has not been adequately addressed because it is subsumed in our knowledge categories. And that is something that needs an upfront engagement. Not that it hasn't happened. Of course, there is a very rich repertoire of scholars who've been engaging with these questions. And what one would like to argue is that we need a more robust sort of engagement with these ways of knowing, these ways of knowledge production, and then see as to how does it impact security studies.
Yeah, there's a really nice line in your article, Navnita, where you talk about the self and other relationship, and you say, under Dharma, it is not until one attains a right relationship with others that one's relationship with the self can be considered right.
Right.
It's a lovely formulation, and it evokes ideas of common security in my mind, and I'd love to talk more about that later. But again, EJIS, we've just published, or we're about to publish, our first special issue, and we'll be putting out a call for another special issue soon. Is this an area where you think we might get calls, or we might get proposals, and how might you frame that?
I think there is a lot of introspection sort of going on in the field of critical security studies as such, but some scholars, including myself, and one of the pieces we've argued, that the sort of self-reflexive gaze of critical security studies has so far been mainly directed outwards, in the sense that the whole discourse on emancipation, and Professor Tarak Barakavi, who's also a colleague in EJIS, he also wrote about it in his post-colonial movement in security studies. That sort of emancipation is a great idea, but it remains like a gift of West to others. So I think that self-reflexive gaze of critical security studies sort of needs to turn inwards and look at its own baseline categories of knowledge, its baseline categories of lines of social and political inquiry. This is, along with Professor Barakavi, many other scholars, we are arguing in terms of sort of a larger project of decolonizing knowledge. So I think there is immense scope within the field of security studies to sort of decolonize its basic knowledge categories and its basic categories of inquiry and lines of inquiry. And a special call, I think, by EJIS in that terrain, I think will invite a very sort of engaging and rigorous debate and sort of take the field forward. And we are building, of course, on the foundations that the critical security studies have already given us, and it's a robust contribution. But I think there is room to grow more by learning from the lived experiences of people around the world, from learning from the philosophies and the histories, and how these histories are connected histories. It's time, I think, we outgrow this binary of West and non-West too. And that's what the idea of the PostWestern IR was. That the West and the non-West are not two separate categories. They never have been. The non-West has been sort of subsumed within this category. It's been the substratum which has been sort of subsumed within the Western IR. I think what we need is a more robust dialogue between the two, a level playing field where these voices are heard and where there isn't a single epistemic yardstick by which these voices are measured or judged, or legitimized or not legitimized, so to say. So yes. I think an EJIS call which can take that conversation forward would really be a contribution to the field of security studies in the years to come.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting, Navnita. We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, but there'll be plenty of other occasions to continue this conversation. Do look out for the special issue call. I would also, you mentioned Tarek Barkawi's work. There is his article, Decolonizing War, which was published in European Journal of International Security, one of the very early issues in 2016. So I'd urge viewers, readers to have a look at that, as well as Navnita's work in the Review of International Studies and International Affairs you've recently published as well, that touches upon these themes. So for now, Navnita, thank you so much, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you, Jason.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.